The wind over Dranara's red dunes sang like dry bones. It carried the taste of iron and memory, whispering through the cracked valleys that had once been seas. Elder Rufus moved slowly across the sand, his robe of faded indigo fluttering against the wind. His skin, deep and creased with age, glistened faintly in the sun's copper glare. Every step he took echoed a lifetime of endurance, one man's rhythm against a world determined to break him. The settlement lay low against the horizon, a scatter of clay domes and solar rigs straining for light. Rufus's small home stood apart, near a half-buried well that had never run dry. The locals called it the Oath Well, though no one remembered what oath had named it so. To Rufus it was simply where he belonged. He'd built it stone by stone, guided by the songs his grandmother had sung about earth, about home, about faith, about promises made in times when skies were blue instead of rust. Inside, the air was cool and still. The hum of a generator pulsed softly, mingling with the faint scent of herbs drying above the doorway. On one wall hung a worn tapestry, stitched with golden thread, a symbol of his ancestors from old Mali, a sunburst encircling a pair of cupped hands. What we give, we keep, his grandmother had told him once. What we keep, we lose. He repeated that to himself as he poured a cup of water from a cracked clay jug. Each drop that fell felt sacred. Water was life here, rarer than truth. He took one sip, then set it aside, saving the rest for later. The horizon shimmered beyond the open doorway, and for a moment he thought he saw something move, something small, dark and stumbling. Rufus shaded his eyes. A figure, tall, thin, swaying, dragged itself across the dunes. Not human. The way the light bent around it was wrong, too smooth, too fluid. He hesitated, old instincts stirring from the wars of his youth. Dranara wasn't kind to strangers, and aliens even less so, but the figure collapsed before reaching the ridge, half swallowed by the sand. He felt the ache in his knees as he hurried forward. The heat pressed down, wrapping him in the scent of metal and salt. When he reached her, she was barely breathing. Her skin shimmered like pearl beneath dust, translucent veins pulsing with pale light. She was neither machine nor human, something in between. Rufus knelt, brushing the sand from her face. Her eyes were closed, her lips cracked. He hesitated only a second before lifting the jug to her mouth. "Drink," he whispered. "Don't let the desert take you." The water trickled between her lips and she trembled. Her eyes fluttered open, silver and vast, reflecting the red sky. Tears welled and fell silently, mixing with the dust. Then, in a voice that sounded like wind through glass, she said, "You promised me this lifetimes ago." Rufus froze. The words pierced deeper than reason. He stared at her, searching for meaning, for memory, but none came. "You've mistaken me for someone else," he said quietly. Her gaze held him, ancient and fragile. "No," she whispered. "You kept your promise." He felt the weight of her words settle in his chest, strange and heavy, promises, oaths. The well's name echoed in his mind. The Oath Well. Something in him stirred, an unease or perhaps recognition buried too deep to name. He lifted her gently, carrying her toward his home as the sun dipped lower, bleeding gold into the horizon. Behind him, the dunes shifted as if listening. Inside, he laid her on the cot near the wall and covered her with his only blanket. The hum of the generator deepened and the shadows lengthened. Rufus poured the last of his water into a bowl beside her. "Rest," he murmured. "We'll talk when you have strength." She did not answer. Her breathing steadied, faint but alive. Rufus sat beside her, his thoughts circling the same phrase, "You promised me this." He stared at his hands, dark and calloused, and for the first time in years he felt unsure of who he was, or what he had once been. Then from outside, a whisper rose again through the dunes, the wind carrying the sound of distant footsteps. The desert night settled heavy and low, wrapping Dranara in its endless silence. The heat bled away fast after sunset, leaving a biting chill that crept through Rufus's thin walls. He sat near the cot where the alien woman rested, the faint glow from her veins lighting the room in trembling silver. Her breathing had steadied, soft and rhythmic, like wind against old reeds. Rufus leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You said I promised you something," he murmured, his voice rough, "but I don't even know your name." Her eyes opened slowly. The silver in them had dimmed, replaced by a deep grey, almost human. "Zyra," she whispered. "That's what they called me before." "Before what?" Her lips parted as if to answer, but only silence came, the kind of silence that carries pain. Rufus felt it press between them, heavy with things unsaid. He reached for the bowl of water beside her. "Drink again," he said. "You're still weak." She lifted her hand, long fingers slender and trembling, and took the bowl. When the water touched her tongue, her body shivered, as though the liquid carried more than life, as though it carried memory. Rufus watched, uneasy. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks of the door, carrying the distant sound of machinery from the nearby mining fields. Drenara never truly slept. Its heartbeat was the grind of human survival. The few who thrived here did so through grit and quiet mercy. Rufus knew both well. "You live alone," Zyra said finally, her voice a thin thread. "Mostly," he answered. "People come and go, but this place, it's not for everyone." Her eyes wandered across the room, the old relics from Earth, the carved figures, the woven cloths. "I still remember where you came from," she said. "I couldn't forget if I tried," Rufus replied, a small smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "My grandmother used to say our stories are seeds. If you bury them, they still grow." Zyra studied him. "And yet you stay here among strangers in a dying world." Rufus chuckled, but there was no joy in it. "Drenara's as alive as any place that still has people willing to fight for it. The others, they call us stubborn. Maybe they're right." Zyra's expression softened. "Stubborn," she repeated quietly. "That word fits you." For a while neither spoke. The generator hummed, steady as a heartbeat. Rufus leaned back, the chair creaking beneath his weight. He could feel her gaze searching him for something. Recognition, regret. He couldn't tell. Finally she asked, "Why did you help me?" Rufus blinked, surprised. "Because you were dying." "That's not reason enough," she said softly. "Not on this world." He frowned. "Maybe not for most, but my people, we were taught different. You don't walk past a thirsty soul. You give water, even if it's your last drop." Her lips trembled. She looked away, blinking fast. "You haven't changed," she whispered. The words pricked him again, sharp, disorienting. "You keep saying that," he muttered. "Changed from what? From who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at her hands as if they were unfamiliar to her. The glow beneath her skin pulsed faintly, a rhythm that didn't match any human heart. Rufus sighed. "You don't have to talk now. Rest. When morning comes, I'll find someone who knows more about your kind. Maybe they can help." "No." Her voice cut through the room, stronger than before. "You can't take me to them." Rufus stilled. "Why not?" "They'll find me." A chill ran through him. "To who will?" Zyra's eyes met his, bright again with that strange, sorrowful light. "The ones who took everything from me. The ones I ran from." Rufus sat back slowly, his pulse heavy in his chest. He didn't know what kind of trouble had found its way into his home, but he knew one thing for certain. The desert had brought her here for a reason. He looked toward the window, where the first trace of dawn touched the horizon, painting the dunes in blood-colored light. Whatever storm was coming, it had already begun. Morning came with a pale light that spread across the dunes like spilled milk. Rufus woke to the soft hum of the generator and the faint sound of Zyra breathing. She was still asleep, but her face no longer carried the same tension it had the night before. For a moment he simply watched her, uneasy, yet unable to look away. There was something in her stillness, something ancient and sorrowful, that made him feel both protective and strangely small. He stepped outside, drawing in the cold desert air. The settlement shimmered in the distance, half buried beneath waves of sand. Beyond it, the mining rigs loomed like broken teeth against the horizon. Humans had fought hard for this land, though few would ever call it home. Rufus filled a metal basin with water from the well, murmuring an old blessing under his breath, one his grandmother had taught him long ago. It was in Bambara, a language few still spoke, a whisper from earth that had survived through memory and song. He poured a little onto the ground. "For the ones who came before," he said softly. When he returned inside, Zaira was awake. She sat upright, her eyes clearer, her movements slow but deliberate. "You speak words I don't know," she said quietly. Rufus smiled faintly. "Old words." "From home." "Home," she repeated. "That's the word you humans use when you mean more than a place." He nodded. "Exactly that." She tilted her head, studying him. "You carry your ancestors with you. I can feel it." Rufus raised an eyebrow. "You can feel that?" She hesitated. "My kind perceives what lingers beneath the surface of things, what memory refuses to let die. When you gave me water, I saw echoes, a river, a promise, a face that looked like yours but was not you." He stiffened. "You're saying you saw—" "What?" "My past." "Not exactly. A connection that stretches beyond time," she said. Her eyes dimmed. "You made me a promise beside a river of light, before the stars had names." Rufus laughed softly, shaking his head. "Lady, I'm just an old man with bad knees and too many regrets. I don't make promises to star gods." "I didn't say gods," Zaira replied. "I said lifetimes." Her tone wasn't mystical, just matter of fact, as if she were describing something as ordinary as sunrise. That made it harder for him to dismiss. He rubbed his temples. "You talk about lifetimes like there's something we can walk through." "Maybe we can," she said. "Maybe some souls keep walking until a promise is fulfilled." He stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You ever think that maybe you're remembering someone else's story?" Her lips curved into a small, sad smile. "Perhaps, but I felt your spirit then, as I feel it now. The same kindness. The same hesitation before mercy." Rufus didn't know what to say. The words stirred something old in him, like a song he'd forgotten, but almost remembered the melody of. He thought of his grandmother again, the stories she told about ancestors returning through bloodlines, carrying unfinished work. He looked at Zaira. "You said someone's after you. That you ran. What could you have done to make anyone chase you across the stars?" Her gaze dropped. "I broke a covenant," she said softly. "I refused to give them what they wanted. I chose life over obedience." Rufus frowned, confused but unwilling to press. "You talk in riddles, girl." "I talk in truths that don't fit your world," she replied, "but you'll see soon enough." He poured her another cup of water. "Then start with this world," he said. "You're here now, that's what matters." Zaira took the cup, her fingers brushing his. A pulse of warmth passed through him, like sunlight through stone. For an instant, he saw something flash behind his eyes. The shimmer of a river, the echo of laughter, a promise whispered in another tongue. Then it was gone. Rufus sat back slowly, heart beating fast. "What was that?" he whispered. Zaira looked at him with quiet sorrow. Memory finding its way home. Outside, the wind rose, sweeping over the dunes with the low rumble of thunder in the distance, a rare sound on Drenara. Rufus turned toward the window, unsettled. The desert had started to remember too. The storm came with no warning. A shroud of copper dust rolled across the desert, turning the sky into a molten sea. Rufus sealed the door and pressed his palm against the wall until the vibrations settled. Inside, the air thickened with tension. Zaira sat near the doorway, her eyes reflecting the faint light of the storm outside. "You feel that?" Rufus asked, voice low. Zaira nodded. "The planet remembers." "Every storm is its heartbeat," Rufus chuckled dryly. "That's poetic. Out here it just means the mines will shut down for a week." But the truth was, the storm felt different. He could sense it in his bones, an unease that had nothing to do with the wind. He moved toward his supply shelf and began packing a small bag. "What are you doing?" Zaira asked. I'm going to the settlement at dawn, Rufus said. You need help I can't give. Maybe the medtechs in Nuru City can do better. Zyra's face tightened. You don't understand. If I'm seen, they'll come for me. You'll be in danger too. Rufus turned to her, his expression hard but not unkind. I've lived through worse than danger. You think this old man's scared of shadows? Her gaze softened. It's not shadows you should fear, it's truth. He shook his head, slinging the bag over his shoulder. Truth never scared me either. The storm howled through the night. Rufus didn't sleep. He sat near the cot, sharpening an old steel knife that had belonged to his father, a relic from Earth. Its blade caught the light with a faint gleam, worn but faithful. Each stroke of the whetstone felt like prayer. When the morning came, the air was clear again, but the sky carried a bruised hue, as if still remembering the storm. Rufus helped Zyra to her feet. She was weak but determined, draped in one of his spare cloaks to hide the glow beneath her skin. They walked toward the edge of the desert, their footprints vanishing behind them almost as soon as they were made. Rufus carried the water pack carefully, aware of how precious each drop was. The sand shimmered like glass, and the sun rose hard and bright. After a long silence, Zyra spoke. You walk as though the ground belongs to you. Rufus smiled faintly. It doesn't, but it knows me. That's enough. Humans, she murmured, always claiming what they cannot keep. Maybe, Rufus said, but we hold on long enough to build something before it's gone. That's how we've survived. She studied him for a moment. Your people fought to exist, even when the universe told them not to. He nodded. Still do. Every day. They paused to rest beneath the shadow of an outcropping. Rufus handed her a small piece of dried fruit from his satchel. She sniffed it curiously before tasting it. Sweet, she said softly. What do you call it? Desert fig, Rufus answered. It's bitter if you take it too early. You gotta wait for the right season. She nodded slowly. Waiting, that's something I've done for longer than you can imagine. Her words hung heavy in the air. Rufus studied her face, wondering how much truth was buried in that statement, but he didn't ask. He'd learned long ago that some answers only came when you were ready to hear them. As they resumed walking, the distant shimmer of Nuru City began to rise from the dunes, towers made of reclaimed alloys, domes that caught the sun like glass lanterns. The sight filled Rufus with quiet pride. Humanity had built this from dust and hope, same as his ancestors had built villages from mud and music. We're close, he said. Zyra slowed her pace. I don't belong there. You don't belong dying in my house either, Rufus replied firmly. You're coming with me. Her eyes darkened. You don't understand what they'll do if they find out what I am. Rufus stopped walking. Then help me understand. Zyra looked at him for a long moment before whispering, They'll want to use me, to finish what they started. A chill slid down his spine, though he didn't yet know why. He adjusted the strap on his bag. Then we move fast and we stay quiet. She nodded reluctantly, and they continued toward the rising city, its towers glinting in the morning light like the promise of salvation, or its illusion. Nuru City shimmered beneath the midday sun, a patchwork of glass, steel, and dust. From afar it looked alive, like a mirage refusing to fade, but up close it pulsed with the raw rhythm of survival. Merchants shouted in mixed tongues, machines clattered over uneven roads, and banners of a dozen worlds hung from the high towers. Humanity had built a place among the stars, but it was a fragile piece, and everyone knew it. Rufus moved through the crowd with Zyra close behind, her hood drawn low to hide the faint glow beneath her skin. She walked carefully, her gaze darting between faces, her posture coiled and wary. Rufus felt the weight of her fear and kept his voice low. Stay close, he murmured. People here notice everything that doesn't fit. They turned down a narrow corridor lined with market stalls. The smell of spice oil and burning metal filled the air. Rufus spotted a familiar sign etched in Old Earth script, Mara's Clinic. The sight gave him a flicker of relief. Mara had been his friend for years, sharp-minded, unshakable, and one of the few medtechs who still treated humans without asking too many questions. Inside, the light dimmed, machines hummed softly, and the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with incense. Mara looked up from a console as they entered. She was tall, with deep brown skin and eyes that could cut through lies. "Rufus," she said, half surprised, half amused. "Didn't expect to see you this far from your dust hole." "Good to see you too," he said, managing a tired smile. "Need your help, she's hurt." Mara's gaze shifted to Zira. Her expression changed instantly, curiosity laced with caution. "What happened to her?" "Found her half dead in the dunes," Rufus replied. "She's different." Zira lowered her hood slightly, revealing her luminous veins. Mara stepped back, whispering, "By the stars, she's not human." "Keep your voice down," Rufus said sharply. Mara stared at him. "Do you have any idea what this means?" "There are patrols searching for something like her. Whole squads of syndicate officers. You shouldn't have brought her here." Rufus's jaw tightened. She needed help. That's reason enough. Before Mara could respond, a low tremor rippled through the floor. The airlights flickered. Rufus instinctively reached for his knife. Outside, the sound of heavy engines roared through the streets. Mara swore under her breath. "They're here." "Who?" Rufus demanded. "The syndicate," she said. "Corporate enforcers. They control the city now. If they're sweeping this district, they're looking for her." Zira's breathing quickened. "They found my trail," she whispered. "They never stop." Rufus turned to Mara. "Is there another way out?" She hesitated, then pointed toward a back corridor. "Service tunnel leads to the old water conduits, but it's not safe. Half of it's collapsed." "Safe stopped being an option," Rufus said. Zira met Mara's gaze. "Thank you," she murmured. Mara frowned. "Don't thank me yet. You're bringing trouble to every human on this side of the city." Rufus gripped her shoulder. "If anyone asks, you never saw us." "I wish that were true," she said grimly. As they slipped through the back corridor, the sound of boots echoed outside. Measured, metallic, inhumanly precise. Rufus quickened his pace, guiding Zira through narrow tunnels that reeked of dust and oil. The walls vibrated, as if the city itself trembled under the weight of what hunted them. "Rufus," Zira whispered, struggling to keep up, "they're not just soldiers. They're connected to something larger. They feel me when I'm near." He glanced back, sweat running down his brow. "Then we keep moving until they can't." The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber where old machinery rusted in silence. Rufus stopped to catch his breath. "We'll rest here for a moment," he said. Zira shook her head. "You don't understand. They won't stop. They can't. I'm not supposed to exist outside their control." Rufus looked at her, seeing the fear behind her calm exterior. "Then it's about time someone broke their control." Above them, distant sirens began to wail. Rufus tightened his grip on the knife at his belt, the blade catching what little light remained. The fight he thought he'd left behind was finding him again, and this time it wasn't just his life on the line. The underground chamber was quiet, except for the low hum of ancient pipes. The air was thick with dust, the smell of rust clinging to every breath. Rufus sat against a wall, the knife across his lap, eyes fixed on the faint light spilling from the cracks above. Zira knelt nearby, her hands resting on the ground as if listening to something beneath it. "They've passed," she whispered. "For now." Rufus exhaled slowly. "Good. Gives us time to think." He looked around the dim chamber and noticed the faded markings on the wall, symbols carved into the stone long before the city above was built. Curved lines, spirals and sunbursts, faint but unmistakably human. "These were made by the first settlers," he murmured. "Black miners from the old coast colonies. They brought the art of Earth with them, carried it through the stars." Zira turned to him. "Why would they carve these?" "To remember who they were," Rufus said softly. "You lose your name long enough, the world tries to write over you. Our people always found ways to carve it back." He reached out and traced the shape of a spiral with his fingertip. "My grandmother used to say these patterns were prayers, each curve a breath, each mark a story. When the world tries to silence you, you leave a mark so deep even time can't erase it. Zyra studied him closely. You speak of ancestors as though they walk beside you. He smiled faintly. They do, maybe not with flesh, but with memory. Their songs still run in my blood. The old ones from Earth, the songs sung in the fields, the hymns of the freedom ships. They're the reason I'm still standing. Zyra tilted her head, curious. Songs powerful enough to keep you alive? More than alive, he said. For they keep us whole. They remind us we're more than what the universe makes of us. Zyra closed her eyes, and for a moment, the faint glow beneath her skin pulsed with rhythm, soft and steady. I hear something, she whispered, like voices, distant, but warm. Rufus chuckled quietly. That's the echo of a people who never stopped speaking. A long silence settled between them, the kind that felt sacred. Rufus thought of his grandmother again, of the old courtyard back on Earth where she'd tell stories under a wide African sky. She used to speak of the Sankofa bird, how it flies forward while looking backward, carrying an egg in its beak. Go back and fetch it, she would say. That's how we move forward, by remembering. Rufus rubbed his chest, feeling the ache of memory and age. Maybe I'm too old to run across deserts, he muttered. Zyra looked at him, her gaze gentle. You're not old. You're rooted. Your spirit reaches far. I can feel it. He chuckled. Rooted, huh? That's one way to call stubborn. She smiled faintly. You say that word with pride. He nodded. Where I come from, stubborn keeps you alive. Above them, a faint vibration ran through the pipes, a reminder of the world still hunting them. But for now, the space felt suspended between past and present. Rufus began to hum, low and deep, a tune older than the stars that shone above the dunes. Zyra listened quietly, her eyes closing as the melody wound through the chamber like a living thing. What is that? She asked softly. An old song from Earth, he said. My grandmother called it Water Will Find Its Way. She said it came from the days when our people crossed deserts and oceans, carrying hope in their throats. Zyra's eyes glistened. Water, she repeated. You gave me water when I had none. Rufus nodded. It's what we do. We find life where no one else bothers to look. Her expression shifted, something reverent sparking in her gaze. Maybe that's why the stars remember you. Maybe that's why the promise still binds us. He didn't answer. The idea of destiny never sat right with him. But as the last notes of his humming faded into silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far larger than either of them had started long before this moment. The ground trembled softly again, breaking the stillness. Zyra's glow dimmed. They're moving closer, she said quietly. Rufus tightened his grip on the knife, the steel cold against his palm. Then we better keep moving, he said. But we'll carry the songs with us, always. The underground tunnels felt colder now, the walls pressing in tighter with each step. The hum of distant engines had faded, but the uneasy feeling never left. Rufus led the way, his hand steady on the hilt of his knife. Zyra walked behind him, her footsteps soft, almost hesitant, as if the weight of her presence was too much for the stone to bear. Almost there, Rufus said, his voice barely a whisper. They passed through a narrow passageway and into a larger chamber. The walls here were cracked, the ancient machinery long since abandoned. A low breeze carried the scent of damp earth. Zyra paused, her eyes scanning the room, alert. Rufus stopped too, glancing at her. What is it? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her gaze moved across the room, lingering on every detail. The walls, the floor, the shadows in the corners. Finally, her voice came, quiet, but filled with an unsettling truth. I thought I felt them. Rufus frowned. Who? The ones who are chasing me, she said, her voice distant, almost lost. The ones I ran from. Before he could ask more, a sudden crash echoed from the tunnel behind them. The sound of boots against metal reverberated in the air, growing louder. They were coming. The syndicate, relentless and unforgiving. Move! Rufus hissed, grabbing Zyra's arm and pulling her toward a small alcove in the corner of the chamber. They crouched low, hidden in the shadows, holding their breath. The footsteps grew louder, then paused. There was a moment of eerie stillness, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Rufus's heart pounded in his chest. He felt the weight of the knife in his hand, the familiarity of battle instincts taking over. But as he looked at Zyra, something stopped him. She was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "They'll kill you," she whispered. "If they find us—" Rufus glanced at her, his face hardening. "Not if we don't let them." The sound of footsteps returned, but this time it was different. There were more of them, a heavy, deliberate rhythm, like they were searching for something or someone. Zyra's eyes met his, her gaze filled with desperation. "Rufus, you don't understand. They've come to take me back. They can't let me go." Rufus clenched his jaw, his thoughts racing. He couldn't let her be captured, not after everything they'd been through. But at the same time, the reality of the situation was sinking in. They couldn't keep running forever. The syndicate wouldn't stop. "They're not getting you," he said firmly, pulling her closer. "We'll fight. We've got a chance if we keep moving, together." Zyra shook her head, her voice breaking. "No, it's not enough. They'll find me. They'll find you too." His grip tightened on her arm. "Not if we don't let them. Come on." They moved quickly through the shadows, carefully stepping around broken machinery and crumbling debris. The air grew thick, heavy with the tension of impending danger. As they reached another set of tunnels, the ground beneath them began to shake again, this time with greater intensity. The walls groaned, the ancient structures seeming to protest against the weight of the conflict unfolding within them. Zyra stumbled, her balance faltering as the tremors shook the ground. Rufus caught her before she fell. "You all right?" he asked, his voice steady despite the urgency. "I'm fine," she gasped, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. Rufus glanced around, his mind working quickly. He had to get them out. He had to make sure they didn't get caught. But just as they reached the exit, the tunnel collapsed in front of them, with a deafening roar. Dust and debris filled the air, and the ground shook violently beneath their feet. Rufus barely had time to react before a large chunk of stone fell, narrowly missing him. Zyra cried out in fear as she was thrown to the ground by the force of the blast. Rufus reached out, pulling her back toward him. But the entrance was completely blocked now, the path they had hoped to take sealed off by rubble. They were trapped. Zyra's voice was barely audible over the sound of the settling debris. "Rufus, they're coming." He closed his eyes, his hand gripping the edge of the stone. The loss hit him like a fist to the chest, the knowledge that no matter what he did, he couldn't keep them safe forever. "Stay here," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I'll find another way." But as he turned to go, Zyra's hand gripped his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "We've already lost." Rufus looked at her, his heart heavy. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt the weight of everything that had come before, the promises, the sacrifices. "Not yet," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We haven't lost." The air in the chamber was thick with dust, the smell of earth and stone pressing in on them as the last remnants of the collapse settled. Rufus stood in front of the blocked exit, his hand still gripping the stone, eyes narrowed in determination. The weight of the rubble, both physical and emotional, bore down on him. But as he turned back to Zyra, he saw something flicker in her eyes, a glint of resolve that hadn't been there before. She was standing, slowly brushing herself off. Her eyes, normally bright and full of fear, were now steady, a quiet intensity pulsing beneath the surface. Rufus noticed how her hands were trembling, but she didn't let it show. "We can still make it," Rufus said, his voice low, almost a command. "There's another way out." Zyra looked at him, her face softening. "You're wrong." Rufus paused, his chest tight with frustration. "What do you mean? We don't have much time." "I mean you don't understand," she interrupted. Her voice wasn't harsh, just weary, as though she had been carrying this burden for too long. "This isn't just about getting away. This is about what's inside of me, what I'm meant to do." Rufus stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? You don't have to do this alone, Zyra. We can get out. I'll help you. Her lips trembled as she inhaled deeply, gathering her thoughts. Then, as if it were the hardest thing she had ever said, she spoke the truth that had been haunting her all along. I wasn't just running from them, she said softly. I was running from myself. Rufus's heart skipped a beat. The words hit him harder than the walls of the tunnel had. He looked at her, confusion mixed with concern. What do you mean? Zyra lowered her gaze, the weight of her revelation pressing on her shoulders. I wasn't just hiding. I was sent to stop what was coming. They altered me, turned me into a weapon, a living tool, and they want me back, to finish their work. Her voice cracked at the last word. Rufus's breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, his gaze softening. Zyra, you're not a weapon, I am, she interrupted, her eyes flashing with a pain that felt ancient. I carry their designs. I was meant to bring their plans to fruition, something worse than anything you've ever known. Rufus took another step, his hand reaching for her. No, you're not a weapon. You're a person. I've seen that. You've shown me that. Now don't let them define you. Zyra's eyes met his, and for a moment the world seemed to pause around them. The truth in her eyes was raw, jagged. She had always known this part of herself, but now it was spilling out like an old wound finally being opened. Rufus, she whispered, her voice small. I was supposed to be their final piece, the one who would carry out their plan. To remake the world, to reshape humanity itself. I was born for it, shaped for it. I don't even know how to be anything else. He reached out, cupping her face gently in his hands. You're more than what they made you to be, he said firmly, looking into her eyes. You're more than just a tool. Her lips parted, her breath quickening. I don't know how to stop it. You don't have to stop it alone, Rufus replied, his voice steady with the weight of his promise. We'll figure it out together. The silence that followed was long and heavy, the kind that spoke of promises and burdens too heavy to be fully understood. Zyra looked down at his hands and then back into his eyes. The flicker of fear in her gaze was slowly replaced by something else, something akin to hope, though fragile. I don't know if I can trust that, she said softly. Rufus's thumb brushed over her cheek, and he offered a small, reassuring smile. Then trust me. I don't need to know everything. I just know we're in this together. Zyra took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment, as if weighing the gravity of his words. When she opened them again, the tension in her shoulders had loosened just slightly. All right, she whispered. Together, then. The weight of the world still hung heavily between them, but now it was lighter somehow. There was a flicker of something in Zyra's eyes that had been missing before, a spark of resolve. She wasn't just the thing they had made her into. She wasn't just a weapon. She was someone who could choose her own path. As the sounds of the syndicate's search grew closer, Rufus grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the remains of the tunnel. Let's move. Together. And for the first time since they met, Zyra didn't hesitate. She followed him without looking back. The tunnels seemed endless. Every step took them deeper into the labyrinth of the city's forgotten underbelly. Rufus's boots echoed faintly off the stone, the only sound in the thick silence that surrounded them. Zyra walked beside him, her eyes scanning the shadows, every movement deliberate and careful. It was as if the world itself had begun to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. They moved quickly, but the weight of what had just been revealed, the truth of Zyra's purpose, her past, pressed heavily on Rufus. Her words echoed in his mind, a reminder of the burden she carried. I was born for this. Rufus, Zyra's voice broke the silence. We can't keep running forever. He turned to her, his face etched with worry but also resolve. I know. We don't have forever, but we've got each other. Her eyes softened, a flicker of something vulnerable passing through her expression. I don't want to drag you into this, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You've done enough already. You've helped me when no one else would. Rufus stopped walking, his hand on her shoulder. We're past the point of just helping. This is bigger than either of us. I'm not going anywhere. Zira's lips trembled, but she nodded, the weight of her own fears threatening to crush her. "You don't know what you're getting into." "I know exactly what I'm getting into," he said firmly, "and I'm still here." They continued, their steps more hurried now. Ahead, a faint light pierced through the darkness, another access point, an old service elevator shaft that might give them the opportunity to escape. But Rufus wasn't focused on that. He was thinking about what lay ahead, about the alliance they needed to form if they were going to survive. "I don't know who else to trust," Zira said, glancing over at him. "The Syndicate has their hands in everything. They'll be everywhere we go." Rufus nodded. "I know someone. He's got a reputation for getting things done, and he owes me a favor. We'll reach him before the Syndicate does." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "Do you think he'll help us?" "He will, but we can't go to him empty-handed. If we want to stand a chance, we need to offer something in return." Zira's brow furrowed. What could we possibly offer him? Rufus's lips curled into a grim smile. "We're going to offer him what the Syndicate wants most. Information. The truth about what they've been hiding, about what you really are." Zira stopped, her face pale. "You want to expose me?" "No." Rufus shook his head, his voice firm. "We expose what they've done. You're not the monster they made you into. You're the one who can stop them. But first, we need to show the world what they've been keeping in the dark." The weight of his words hung between them like a promise that was both terrifying and powerful. Zira's eyes softened, but the resolve was still there, flickering beneath the surface. "I never asked for this," she said quietly. Rufus's gaze softened. "None of us ever do, but we fight anyway. We fight for what's right, even if it's not what we imagined." As they reached the service shaft, Rufus paused and turned to her once more. "This is where we make our stand. We can't keep running. It's time to take the fight to them." Zira stood still for a long moment, as if weighing the choice in her mind. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "All right." Together, Rufus reached out, placing his hand on the small of her back as they stepped toward the shaft. The alliance they were forming wasn't just between two people. It was the beginning of something larger, a movement that could shift the balance of power in a universe where humanity had always been seen as weak. The city above them hummed, unaware of the storm that was about to break. But down in the tunnels, Rufus and Zira knew that this fight was just beginning. The underground tunnels gave way to a larger, more open chamber, the stone walls slick with moisture, their surfaces lit by the faint glow of flickering lights. The hum of machinery echoed from deeper within the complex, and the air smelled of old oil and damp metal. Rufus and Zira moved quietly, their shadows dancing across the uneven floor as they approached a hidden access point, a small fortified room where they would meet the ally Rufus had promised. It felt like the calm before the storm. Rufus couldn't shake the nagging feeling that time was running out. Every step, every breath carried the weight of what was about to come. The Syndicate was closing in. They were everywhere, and soon they would find them, but the only way out was through. Zira walked beside him, her face pale, her eyes distant as if lost in thought. Rufus could feel her tension, her anxiety, even without looking at her. She had spent her whole life running from her past, from the purpose forced upon her. And now, for the first time, she was facing that truth head-on. It was a battle she wasn't sure she was ready to fight. "You all right?" Rufus asked, his voice low, but with a gentleness that only he could offer. She nodded, though it wasn't convincing. "I'm just trying to prepare myself. I've never been part of a fight like this before, never had a choice." "You have a choice now," Rufus said firmly, his eyes meeting hers. "This time, we fight on your terms." "Not theirs." Zira didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for the small pendant around her neck, an intricate, shining piece of jewelry that looked like it had been passed down through generations. Rufus had seen it before, but never like this, never with the same intensity. "This was my mother's," Zira said softly. "She gave it to me before I left home. It was supposed to protect me. But now it feels like a reminder of what I've lost." Rufus stopped walking, his hand resting gently on her arm. "You haven't lost everything. You still have the power to make things right." She looked at him, the pain in her eyes sharper than before. "What if it's too late? What if everything I was made to do can't be undone?" "We'll make it right," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We have to believe that." They continued walking, the chamber opening into a much larger, heavily secured room. Rufus motioned for Zaira to follow him, and they entered cautiously. Inside, a man stood waiting, leaning against a table filled with various tools and devices. His posture was casual, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, assessing. The moment he saw Rufus, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Well, well, Rufus," the man said with a grin. "I didn't think I'd be seeing you again so soon." Rufus nodded grimly. "This is important." "We don't have time for pleasantries, Malik." Malik's smile faded as he saw Zaira behind Rufus, her presence unmistakable. His gaze shifted from her to Rufus. "I see. So, this is the one." Zaira stood tall, meeting Malik's eyes. "I'm not here for your games. We need your help." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Straight to the point. I like that." "What exactly do you need, then?" "We need to hit them hard," Rufus said. "Take them down where it hurts. The Syndicate has something they're hiding, something bigger than what we've seen. We need to expose it." Malik's eyes narrowed. "I've heard rumors, big ones. But you're talking about going to war with the Syndicate, Rufus? That's no small thing." "I know," Rufus replied. "That's why we need you. You're the only one who can get us the access we need, and once we have it, we take them out." Malik sighed, rubbing his chin. "And what's in this for me?" "You'll have everything you need to take them down," Rufus said, his voice unwavering. "They've been operating in the shadows for too long. No one's been able to touch them. But you together, we can change that." Malik was silent for a long moment, the tension thick in the air. Finally, he pushed off the table, walking toward them with a calculated look in his eyes. "All right, Rufus. You've got my attention. But this isn't going to be easy. It's going to get messy, and there's no turning back once we start." "We're ready for that," Rufus said, his voice steady. "We'll burn the whole thing down if we have to." Malik paused, then nodded as if weighing the magnitude of their plan. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. Fine. Let's make it happen." Rufus exhaled, the weight lifting from his shoulders just slightly. They had their plan. They had the ally they needed. Now all that remained was to put it into action. Zaira stood beside him, her gaze unwavering. She had found something she hadn't expected, not just an ally, but a team. And with that, a flicker of hope ignited within her, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could still change the course of everything. "You ready?" Rufus asked her, his voice soft but filled with purpose. She nodded, her resolve solidifying. "Let's do it." And with that, they turned toward the exit, ready to take on the fight that was about to unfold. The final battle wasn't just about survival. It was about rewriting their own destinies. Together. The city's skyline stretched high above them, a jagged silhouette of metal and glass. The air felt different now, charged with anticipation, heavy with the promise of chaos. Rufus and Zaira stood at the edge of the industrial district, a place where the Syndicate's operations ran deep, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and corporate lies. They had gathered their allies, planned their strike, but none of it felt real until they were here, facing the heart of the beast. The sound of distant engines hummed, muffled by the thick concrete walls. It was the sound of power moving, of soldiers in the streets, their presence a looming threat. But this time they weren't running. They were going to make a stand. Zaira's hands were clenched at her sides, her body tense as she stared down the street. The weight of her past was heavy on her, but there was something else now, something fierce, something determined. This was her moment. She wasn't just running anymore. She wasn't the weapon they had created. She was the one who would stop them. "We'll go in through the back," Rufus said, his voice low and steady. "Malik's team has cleared the way. We hit them hard, fast, and get the intel we need." Zaira nodded without speaking, her eyes scanning the horizon, her breath steady despite the tension in the air. Her mind kept returning to the conversation with Rufus earlier, to the way he had promised they would fight on her terms, not the syndicate's. That promise was the fire she needed to keep going. She had always been a piece in their game, a tool, but now she was the player. Rufus motioned for her to follow as he led the way down a narrow alley. They moved quickly, staying out of sight, but the noise of the battle ahead only grew louder. The syndicate wasn't going to make this easy. They had men stationed at every corner, every entrance, guarding the heart of their operation. But that was exactly what Rufus was counting on. As they rounded a corner, they encountered their first line of resistance, a group of syndicate soldiers in black armor, their weapons raised and ready. The tension in the air thickened, like the calm before a storm. Rufus didn't hesitate. He motioned for Zira to stay back as he stepped forward, drawing his knife. "Stay low." "We move fast," Rufus whispered to Zira, his voice steady despite the rising adrenaline in his chest. Zira's hand moved instinctively to the small, hidden weapon at her side, a plasma blade, sharp and lethal. She nodded, her grip tightening on it as they prepared to engage. The first soldier lunged toward Rufus, but he was faster, sidestepping the attack and slashing the soldier's weapon aside. With a swift movement, he disarmed the man and knocked him to the ground. The others hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but that brief pause was all Rufus needed. In an instant, the alley erupted into chaos. Zira moved with deadly precision, her blade cutting through the air with a speed that left no room for error. The syndicate soldiers fought back, but they were no match for the fire and fury that had been building inside her. The years of running, of hiding, had forged something in her, a killer's instinct, a drive to survive that was as sharp as any weapon. Rufus fought beside her, a fierce protector but also a trusted partner. He didn't need to speak. They had fought alongside each other long enough to understand each other's moves, each other's rhythm. Every step, every strike was in sync, a dance of violence and strategy that left no room for hesitation. The last of the syndicate soldiers crumpled to the ground, and silence fell over the alley. The battle was far from over, but for a moment they had a brief respite. Zira's chest heaved as she wiped the blood from her blade, her heart still pounding in her ears. She wasn't used to this, the violence, the killing, but she knew deep down it was necessary. It was the only way to stop them. "We've got to keep moving," Rufus said, his voice gruff but calm. He didn't need to say more. They both knew the stakes. Zira nodded, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the area ahead. The real fight was still waiting for them, the syndicate's stronghold just beyond the next wall, but they had broken through the first line of defense. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. They moved quickly, their steps echoing in the narrow streets as they approached the entrance to the syndicate's operations. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time in her life, Zira didn't feel like a weapon. She felt like a force of nature, unstoppable, fierce, and ready to take down everything the syndicate had built. Rufus paused for a moment, looking at her with a nod of approval. "You're ready," he said simply. Zira met his gaze, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "We're ready." And with that, they crossed the threshold into the heart of the enemy's stronghold, prepared to do whatever it took to bring it all down. The heavy doors of the syndicate's command center loomed in front of them, sleek and cold, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. Rufus and Zira stood at the entrance, eyes fixed on the towering structure before them. The sounds of the battle outside faded into silence, leaving only the hum of the machines and the distant clatter of weapons. Rufus's grip tightened on the hilt of his knife, a sense of finality settling in. This wasn't just a fight. It wasn't just about survival. It was about everything he had lived for, the legacy he carried with him, the stories of his ancestors that ran through his veins. The fight ahead was bigger than anything he could have imagined. It was a battle for humanity's future, a fight to reclaim the power that had been stolen from them by forces far more dangerous than he had ever known. "I never thought it would come to this," Rufus said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of the moment. He looked over at Zira, whose eyes were dark with resolve. She had come a long way since their first meeting, from a woman running from her past to someone ready to face her future. Zira's expression softened, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't think I'd have anyone to fight beside me. But now I know why I was made this way. I'm not running anymore. I'm here to finish what they started." Rufus nodded. "We're here to make sure they don't finish what they started." They stood for a moment in silence, taking in the enormity of the task ahead. The building before them held the heart of the Syndicate's operations. Behind those doors were the secrets they had been hiding, the things they had stolen from humanity. But more than that, it was where the endgame would unfold, the place where they would either succeed or fail. Zira took a deep breath. "You've been carrying this fight your whole life. I never asked you to, but I'm ready now. Let's finish it." Rufus looked at her, the weight of his own history pressing down on him. He had lived through war, through loss, through the battles that shaped him into the man he was. But this was different. This was a fight for the future, for a chance to break the chains that had bound them for so long. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly, "but I'll fight beside you, Zira. To the end." The doors before them slid open, revealing the stark metallic interior of the Syndicate's command center. Bright lights flashed above, casting harsh shadows across the room. It was a place of cold calculation, where lives were manipulated, controlled and discarded. It was a place that had shaped Zira into a weapon, but now she was something more. They stepped inside, their presence almost unnoticed by the automated systems scanning their every movement. But they weren't here to sneak past security. They were here to tear everything down, to expose the Syndicate for the monsters they were. As they moved deeper into the facility, Rufus's mind raced, recalling every lesson, every story his grandmother had told him. He had been raised on the legacy of survival, the idea that no matter what, humanity would find a way to endure. He had always believed that, even when it seemed impossible. But now, more than ever, he understood that survival wasn't just about living. It was about fighting for something greater. "We're close," he muttered, his voice low. "Malik's team has disabled the main security grid. We should have a window to get to the central data core." Zira nodded, her steps confident now. "We'll make sure the truth gets out. They can't hide it any longer." The central hub loomed ahead of them, a massive room filled with towering screens, glowing with data they couldn't yet comprehend. But they didn't need to understand it. They just needed to destroy it. As they approached the core, Zira hesitated for just a moment, her hand brushing against the cool metal of the wall. "This is where it all started, isn't it?" she said quietly. Rufus's gaze softened. "This is where it ends." They stood at the edge of the room, the heart of the Syndicate's empire pulsating in front of them. The air was thick with the weight of what was to come. Zira's hand hovered over the control panel, her fingers trembling just slightly. Rufus stepped closer, his hand steady on her shoulder. "We do this together," he said, his voice firm. Zira took a deep breath, and in that moment, the weight of their shared history, their shared struggle, was crystal clear. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been oppressed, for everyone who had been silenced. With a final, determined look, Zira pressed the button. The screens flickered, the lights dimmed, and the room trembled as the core's security systems began to shut down. "This is for the future," she whispered. Rufus stood beside her, watching as the first signs of their victory began to unfold. The Syndicate's empire, built on lies and manipulation, was beginning to crumble. It was only a matter of time before the truth would spread, and in that moment, Rufus knew that the legacy he carried wasn't just his own. It was the legacy of everyone who had fought for freedom, for truth, and for a world where humanity could finally stand tall, unafraid. The building was in chaos. The hum of the central core had slowed to a faint whine, replaced by the distant sound of alarms echoing through the hallways. The screens that once displayed the Syndicate's encrypted data now blinked erratically, flashing warning signs of imminent collapse. Rufus and Zira stood at the heart of it all, breathing heavily, their pulse still racing from the battle they had just fought. But in the midst of the destruction, there was a palpable shift, like the ground was finally cracking, like the chains that had held humanity in place were beginning to snap. The truth was out. The Syndicate's lies, their manipulations, their reign of power were crumbling. And with each second that passed, humanity's future was being rewritten. Rufus leaned against the control panel, the weight of everything he had fought for pressing down on him. He looked at Zaira, her face illuminated by the flickering lights, her expression fierce, yet weary. The girl who had once been a pawn in their game had become the force that brought their empire to its knees. "You did it," Rufus said quietly, his voice full of awe and pride. "You're free now." "We all are." Zaira's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a flicker of doubt. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. Instead, she glanced at the chaos around them, the reality of what they had just done sinking in. "I never thought it would feel like this," she said, her voice a soft whisper. It's not over, is it?" "No," Rufus answered, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the room. "But it's the beginning. We've exposed them, but the fight's far from over. We'll have to rebuild everything, piece by piece. There's still a long way to go." Zaira nodded, her hand instinctively going to the pendant around her neck, the symbol of her past, her mother's gift. She didn't need to say anything more. The weight of that simple gesture spoke volumes. "We'll fight together," she said, her voice steady. "We'll rebuild it all, a future where we're not controlled, where we're free." Rufus's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, the edge of exhaustion in his chest seemed to lift, if only slightly. He had fought for so long, for so many. But now, standing beside Zaira, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the future he had always hoped for. A future where the past could be laid to rest, where the legacy of the oppressed could become something new. "Together," he agreed, his voice resolute. "We won't stop until the world is what it should have been all along." They stood there for a moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air, the echoes of their past battles blending with the promise of what was to come. The battle was won, but the war for humanity's freedom had only just begun. The journey ahead would be long, the obstacles many. But with the truth finally in the open, with the Syndicate's empire exposed, Rufus and Zaira knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The world outside was still full of uncertainty, full of danger. But for the first time, it also held hope. Hope for change, for a future built on truth and resilience, for a humanity that had fought for its place in the stars. Rufus glanced at Zaira, his gaze filled with something deeper than gratitude, something that spoke of shared pain, of survival, and of the unspoken bond they had forged together. "Whatever happens next," he said, his voice unwavering, "we do it together. No one can take that from us." Zaira's lips curled into a small smile, and for the first time it was one that reached her eyes. She placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm, her gaze steady. "Together," she echoed. And as they turned toward the doorway, the faintest glimmer of dawn crept through the cracks in the building, painting the dark walls with shades of orange and pink. The world outside was waiting. The future of humanity, uncertain but full of possibility, was now in their hands. The streets outside the Syndicate's command center were quieter now, the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions slowly fading into nothingness. The battle was over, but its aftermath hung in the air, thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. Rufus and Zaira stood together, surveying the cityscape ahead of them. What was once a tightly controlled, cold and mechanical world now felt like a blank canvas, awaiting the first strokes of a new beginning. Zaira's eyes scanned the horizon, the heavy weight of what they had accomplished settling on her shoulders. She wasn't sure what it all meant, what this new world would look like, but one thing was clear. They had done something that had never been done before. They had taken down the Syndicate, the invisible hand that had controlled so many lives, and exposed its darkest secrets, and with that they had shattered the chains that had bound them for so long. Rufus stood beside her, his expression unreadable as he looked at the destruction around them. The city was still standing, but it had been irreparably changed. The people who lived here, the ones who had suffered under the Syndicate's reign, would now have to find their way. Would they rebuild, Or would they choose a different path entirely? Rufus didn't know. But he knew one thing. This was their fight now. "You ever think we'd make it this far?" Rufus asked, his voice quiet as he looked at Zira. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs as if it were the first time she'd truly breathed in years. "No," she said finally, her voice tinged with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I never thought I'd have the chance to change anything. I always thought I was meant to be just a tool." Rufus turned to her, his gaze soft but filled with understanding. "You were never just a tool, Zira. You were always meant for something greater. They tried to make you something you weren't, but you found your way back." She met his gaze, a flicker of something like hope in her eyes. Maybe this was the path I was meant to walk all along." For a moment the world around them felt still, as if the city itself was waiting. But the weight of their journey, the pain, the loss, and the sacrifices they had made, was not easily forgotten. The victory they had won was not without cost. There were still wounds that needed to heal, still scars that would never fade. But in the distance, a glimmer of light began to break through the clouds, casting a soft glow on the broken streets. "This is just the beginning," Rufus said, his voice steady with conviction. "The world's never been like this before. We've set something in motion that can't be stopped. But it's up to us to guide it." Zira nodded, her eyes narrowing as she turned her gaze back to the horizon. "I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if the people will rise or fall, if they'll use this freedom to build something better, or tear it all down. But we've given them the chance to choose." Rufus's lips curled into a small, wry smile. "And that's all we can do. We don't get to choose for them. But we can show them what's possible." She smiled back at him, a faint glimmer of something stronger than hope, a quiet, determined resolve. "Then let's make sure they choose wisely." Together, they turned away from the wreckage and began walking down the street, side by side. The future wasn't clear. There were still obstacles to face, still battles to fight. But the world was different now. The Syndicate was gone, and with its fall, humanity had a chance to rebuild, to define itself on its own terms. As they walked, the first signs of a new dawn broke across the city, casting light on the path ahead. It was a fragile thing, this hope they had created, but it was real, and it was theirs to protect. Rufus's mind wandered back to the lessons his grandmother had taught him, the importance of fighting for something greater than yourself, the strength of community, of standing together in the face of impossible odds. And now, as the weight of their victory settled on him, he realized that the true legacy of their fight wasn't just about bringing down the Syndicate. It was about showing the world that they could overcome anything if they stood united. Zira glanced at him as they walked, her hand brushing against his. He looked at her, a quiet understanding passing between them. Their bond was more than just the fight they had shared. It was the shared history, the shared pain, the shared future. They had given each other a chance at something they never thought possible, and now, together, they would face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it was theirs to shape. The city was still waking up. Dawn's first light filtered through the ruins, casting long shadows over the streets where the Syndicate's empire had once reigned. But now there was a silence, quiet, profound, almost sacred. The chaos of the previous days had given way to something new, something fragile, yet full of potential. Rufus and Zira stood at the top of a crumbling tower, gazing out over the city. Below them, the streets were slowly coming to life as people emerged from the shelters, uncertain but hopeful. The destruction was widespread, but so was the opportunity to rebuild. They had won the battle, but the true test was what they did next. Rufus exhaled, his breath steady despite the weight of the moment. "I never thought I'd see the day," he said, his voice low, reflecting a lifetime of hard-fought struggles. "When you spend your whole life fighting, you never really imagine what comes after." Zira stood beside him, her face illuminated by the soft light of the morning. She was different now, stronger, more at peace with herself, The war within her had ended, but a new journey had begun, one that wasn't about survival but about shaping something new, something better. "We've given them a chance," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But we can't do it for them. They'll have to choose what happens next." Rufus turned to her, his eyes filled with understanding. "You're right. We've opened the door, but it's up to them to walk through it." Zira's gaze shifted back to the horizon, the vast expanse of the city laid out before them, a broken yet beautiful canvas waiting to be painted. The world was full of possibilities now, but it was also filled with uncertainty. The people had tasted freedom, but the real challenge lay in how they would use it. "They'll need leaders," she said after a pause. "People who know what it means to fight for something bigger than themselves, to guide them." Rufus nodded slowly, the thought lingering in the air. "We can't lead them all, but we can help them find their way. Teach them what we've learned. The truth isn't just about exposing the syndicate. It's about understanding what we stand for now. Who we are without them." Zira turned to face him, her eyes burning with a quiet intensity. "And what is that? Who are we now?" Rufus smiled, though it was a bittersweet expression. "We're survivors. But more than that, we're people who fought for a chance to live on our own terms. No one owns us. Not now, not ever again." She considered his words, the weight of them settling into her bones. She had spent so long running from the past, trying to escape the person they had created. But now she realized she didn't have to escape. She just had to move forward, to decide who she was, without the chains that had once held her. "Then we build," she said, her voice firm. "We build something that lasts. Something that they can never take from us." Rufus placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "Together," he said, "we'll rebuild, brick by brick, and we'll make sure the mistakes of the past don't shape the future." As the sun rose higher, the light seemed to fill the broken streets, illuminating the places that had once been lost to darkness. People were beginning to gather in the squares, in the streets, unsure but united in a common cause. The air was thick with the promise of change, of a future that was now in their hands. Zira glanced at him, a small but determined smile playing at the corners of her lips. "This is our chance. We can't let it slip away." Rufus nodded, the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind. This was what he had fought for, what he had believed in all along. A world where they could stand together, free of the chains that had once held them down. And as they stepped away from the tower, heading down into the city, they knew the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. But they weren't alone anymore. The people were with them, and together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The dawn was no longer just the beginning of a new day. It was the beginning of a new world.